California spent $439 million to escape 600 feet of road, not to fix it, to escape it. The road is still there, a cracked strip of Highway 1 hanging 300 feet above the Pacific between Pacifica and Montara. In 2006, a 1-inch crack in its pavement grew to 4 inches over a single weekend, and a 6-foot boulder dropped onto the center line. For 76 years, locals gave the same advice: never drive through Devil's Slide after dark. The strangest part isn't the mountain. It's a memo somebody pulled out of an office fax machine. We'll get to the memo. First, you need to understand the road, because the road is the kind of thing that sounds invented until you see the paperwork. About 15 miles south of San Francisco, Highway 1 leaves Pacifica, climbs the shoulder of Montara Mountain, and swings out onto a coastal promontory that geologists describe with slopes running 30 to 50% grade. That's not a road grade. That's the terrain the road was glued onto. The rock face drops toward the ocean in eroded chutes. The soil sits on fractured stone, and the whole slope has a habit of letting go without asking permission. The name was not marketing. People called it Devil's Slide because the slide part was literal, and the devil part felt earned, and the state of California ran its most famous coastal highway straight across it. Now, the After Dark warning. It sounds like a campfire line, the kind of thing a gas station attendant says to tourists. But at Devil's Slide, the warning had engineering behind it. There were no lights. There were stretches with drops of hundreds of feet, and for much of the road's life, not much between your tires and the edge. The fog on this coast doesn't drift in politely. It erases the road in front of you. And here's the part that separates Devil's Slide from every other scary cliff road in America. The pavement itself moved. Not metaphorically. In wet winters, Caltrans engineers measured the roadbed creeping toward the ocean. A road you drove on Friday evening was not guaranteed to be the same road on Saturday morning. The mountain worked the night shift. That's the physical truth under the warning. There's a darker cultural layer, too. Over the decades, Devil's Slide picked up a grim reputation in Bay Area history. A remote, unlit cliff a few minutes from a major city, where cars went over the edge and where recoveries at the base of the cliff show up again and again in old news coverage. We're not going to dramatize any of that, because it doesn't need dramatizing. It's enough to say that when locals told you not to drive it after dark, they weren't just talking about the fog. So the obvious question, who looks at a slope that is actively falling into the Pacific and decides to build a road on it? Nobody, actually. That's the first twist. Nobody chose this route for a road. A railroad chose it, and the railroad died doing it. Go back to 1905. A company called the Ocean Shore Railroad charters itself with a gorgeous doomed plan. An electric railway running down the coast from San Francisco towards Santa Cruz, hauling day trippers to the beaches and opening up the coast side for real estate. The slogan was, "Reaches the Beaches." The route ran straight across the face of Devil's Slide, because if you're a railroad, you can't climb over Montara Mountain. You have to blast a level grade into whatever the coast gives you. So crews cut a shelf into the slide zone, a narrow bench of rock and fill hanging over the surf. Then, in April 1906, while the line was still under construction, the San Francisco earthquake hit. On this stretch of coast, the ground didn't just shake. Sections of the grade and construction equipment went into the ocean. The company rebuilt, kept laying track, ran its trains, and bled money for years. The beaches never produced the boom. The automobile showed up and started eating the railroad's customers. By 1920, the Ocean Shore Railroad was finished, bankrupt, abandoned. What it left behind was a dead man's shelf carved across an active landslide. Here's where you'd expect the story to end. A failed railroad grade on a collapsing cliff should just erode quietly into the sea. Instead, the state of California looked at that shelf and saw free engineering. In the 1930s, the state was building out the Coastside Highway, the road that would become part of Highway 1, and the old railroad corridor across Devil's Slide offered something irresistible. A route that had already been blasted, already been graded, already existed. Using it saved money. The highway across Devil's Slide opened to traffic in 1937, a ribbon of modern pavement inheriting a bankrupt railroad's single worst decision. The mountain gave its answer almost immediately. In 1940, 3 years into the road's life, a major landslide destroyed much of it. 3 years, the state rebuilt. That right there is the entire next 7 decades of this story, compressed. The mountain breaks the road. The state rebuilds the road. The mountain waits. Keep that rhythm in your head because it never stops. Slide, repair, reopen. Slide, repair, reopen. The road became a maintenance patient that never got discharged. Crews installed drains to bleed water out of the hillside. Engineers glued crack gauges across the pavement, little instruments whose only job was to report how fast the road was leaving. Think about that for a second. This was a state highway with medical monitoring. And every time the mountain went around, the consequences weren't abstract. Devil's Slide was the only coastal link between Pacifica and the little towns to the south, Montara, Moss Beach, Princeton, on down to Half Moon Bay. When the road closed, a 7-mile drive between neighbors became a 45-mile detour over the mountains and back. Kids' schools, jobs, deliveries, ambulances, all of it rerouted around a broken 600 feet of pavement. The coastside learned to live with a highway that behaved like weather, mostly fine, occasionally catastrophic, never guaranteed. There's one more character to introduce before the fight starts, and it's the strangest object on the whole mountain. In the early 1940s, with the country at war, the military built a concrete observation station on the slope above the road, part of the harbor defenses of San Francisco, a set of eyes watching for enemy ships approaching the Golden Gate. It's a blockhouse of reinforced concrete, and it was built on solid ground. It is not on solid ground anymore. In the decades since, erosion has eaten the slope out from under and around it, leaving the bunker stranded on top of an isolated rock pinnacle like a concrete birdhouse on a crumbling post. Drivers on Highway 1 stared at it for generations and assumed it was some kind of art piece or a hoax. It's neither. It's a war relic that the mountain slowly turned into a warning sign. If you ever need a single image to explain Devil's Slide, it's this. Even the thing built to be permanent is now balanced on leftovers. The ground that held it up simply left. So, by the middle of the 20th century, here's the situation. California owns a stretch of its signature coastal highway that was routed by a dead railroad, destroyed in its 3rd year of life, and rebuilt on ground that engineers know is moving. The road is unlit, fog-bound, and flanked by drops that show up in police reports. The towns south of it depend on it completely, which means every closure is an economic event and an emergency services problem, not just a traffic story. And looming over all of it is a piece of geological arithmetic that nobody in Sacramento wanted to say out loud. You cannot permanently repair a road that is built on top of the thing that keeps destroying it. The state knew this. The engineers knew this. The maintenance budget screamed it every wet winter. Devil's Slide wasn't a road problem you could patch. It was a location problem. The only real fix was to stop being there. Which brings us to 1958, and the moment this stops being a story about geology and becomes a story about government. Because in 1958 the state finally admitted the mountain had won, sort of, and began planning an escape route. a brand new inland freeway bypass that would abandon the cliff entirely and carry Highway 1 up and over Montara Mountain, far from the slide. On paper, it was the rational move. Retreat from the unstable ground. Build on rock that stays put. Problem solved. Here's where it gets strange. That escape plan, the reasonable, obvious, engineer-approved solution, would take 55 years to actually happen. Not because of the mountain. The mountain was, for once, not the obstacle. The plan would be fought in courtrooms, buried in environmental studies, exposed by leaked documents, and finally settled not by engineers or governors but by ordinary coastside residents voting at a ballot box. After a citizen activist fed a records request into a fax machine and got back a dozen pages that made a state agency look like it had been cooking its own numbers. The state had a plan. The desert has time. This coast has lawyers. And while the humans argued for decades, the road stayed exactly where it had always been, on the slide, in the fog, in the dark, carrying commuters and tourists and school buses across ground that was measurably in motion. Every winter of delay was another roll of the dice. In one of those winters, a 160-foot section of the highway would drop 5 feet and cut the coastside in half for months. In another, the pavement would crack open over a single weekend, while a boulder the size of a refrigerator sat in the road. The warning never changed. Don't drive Devil's Slide after dark. What changed was who deserved the blame for the fact that deep into the 21st century, people still had to. To understand how a 600-foot problem swallowed half a century and $439 million, you have to follow the bypass, a highway that came within one court ruling of existing on land the state had already mostly bought. The escape plan had a name, the Martini Creek Bypass, and on a Caltrans drawing it looked clean. A new alignment leaving Highway 1 at Linda Mar Boulevard in Pacifica, climbing up and over the shoulder of Montara Mountain and rejoining the coast highway down near Montara State Beach. 4.5 miles of new road. No cliff, no slide, no more crack gauges. Then you looked at what building it actually required, and the clean drawing turned into something else. This was a mountain, and mountains don't accept freeways politely. The design called for as many as 11 massive cuts and fills, gouges and embankments up to 106 feet wide and 275 feet high. 275 feet. That's a 20-plus story building made of moved earth. And though Caltrans said the road would be striped for 2 lanes, it would be paved wide enough for 4. The coastside towns did the math on that one immediately. You don't grade a 4-lane footprint through a mountain to serve a 2-lane country highway. You do it because you're planning for the highway this quiet coast was never supposed to have. One local who saw the design put it in 3 words. I was appalled. There was one more detail, and it's the one that lit the fuse. The alignment ran through McNee Ranch State Park, public parkland on the flank of Montara Mountain. So the state's plan to escape one scar on the landscape involved carving a bigger one through a park. To fix the road, wound the mountain. That's the trade Caltrans put on the table. And Caltrans was serious. This wasn't a study gathering dust. The agency was buying the route. By 1975, 55% of the right-of-way had already been acquired. More than half the escape road existed on paper, in deeds, in state filing cabinets. The bypass was not almost proposed, it was almost built. Then it hit the courts. The Sierra Club, a local group called the Committee for Green Foothills, and the owners of Shamrock Ranch sued, arguing the agency had failed to properly study what the project would do to the parkland in its path, including something as specific as construction noise over the campgrounds at McNee Ranch. A federal judge agreed, and an injunction stopped the bypass. Caltrans went back, did more studies, kept the plan alive on paper, the agency's own planner, Ed Pang, later described dutifully running the additional noise analysis the court ordered. But the momentum was gone. The bulldozers never came. So take stock of where this leaves everyone by the late 1980s. The state has spent 30 years and real money planning and partially buying an escape route it cannot legally build. The environmental groups have blocked the bypass but haven't fixed anything. The traffic is still on the slide. And the road itself has not been consulted about any of this. It's still up there in the fog, moving in wet winters, carrying the coastside's entire life across ground that geologists monitor like a patient. There was a third option, and everyone knew it. Go through the mountain instead of over it. A tunnel. Bore straight through the stable rock behind the slide, leave the cliff to the seagulls. Environmentalists liked it because it spared the park. Locals liked it because it spared the coast. Caltrans hated it. The agency's position was blunt. A tunnel wasn't feasible at Devil's Slide, and it was far too expensive. Caltrans put the tunnel at $126 million against roughly $90 million for its beloved bypass. Case closed, said the state. The numbers don't lie. Hold that thought about numbers. Because in January 1995, the mountain re-entered the conversation, and it did not send a memo. After weeks of winter storms, a 160-foot section of Highway 1 at Devil's Slide buckled and slipped 5 feet toward the ocean. 5 feet. The road didn't crack. It left. Caltrans closed the highway, and this time the closure didn't last days or weeks. It lasted 158 days, more than 5 months, the longest closure in the road's history, and over $3 million in repairs just to put the pavement back on ground that had already proven it wouldn't hold it. Understand what 158 days means on this coast. The 7-mile drive from Pacifica to Montara became a 45-mile detour every day, both directions. Commutes stretched toward 2 hours. Fire and medical mutual aid from Pacifica was cut off. If you lived in Montara and something went wrong, help now came the long way around a mountain, and the businesses south of the slide watched their customers simply stop existing. Raj Mithal, who owned the Farallone Inn bed and breakfast in Montara, later remembered it flatly. They were open, and business was at a standstill. Not slow, a standstill. His inn survived. Others spent 1995 learning that their entire business model had been 600 feet of pavement they didn't own and couldn't fix. 5 months of that will radicalize a coastline. And it did. The 1995 closure turned the tunnel from a nice idea into a demand. That spring, an independent panel of experts formally recommended boring a tunnel about 4,600 feet long, 2 to 3 years to build, and priced it at $50 to $70 million. Read those numbers again side by side. Caltrans. A tunnel costs $126 million. Can't be done. Independent panel. Same mountain, same hole. $50 to $70 million. Absolutely can be done. That's not a rounding disagreement. That's one estimate nearly double the top of the other for the same project. And the expensive number belonged to the agency that had spent 30 years trying to build something else. County Supervisor Ted Limpert smelled it. He pushed Caltrans for the analysis behind its figures and got stonewalled. He later described the period as ugly, an agency so confident in its political backing that it felt no obligation to explain itself to the officials asking. He called it a classic case of a bureaucracy telling a public official to go to hell. Another supervisor, Ruben Bareilles, lined up with him. Local tunnel advocates like Zoe Kirstein Tucker kept organizing. Kirstein Tucker would later recall a Caltrans spokesperson telling a reporter, in effect, "Sure, we'll evaluate the tunnel proposal and say it's too expensive, Sit with that quote. The evaluation's conclusion, announced before the evaluation. In July 1995, the Federal Highway Administration stepped in and ordered Caltrans to genuinely re-examine the tunnel against the bypass. That was a crack in the wall. What broke the wall was a fax machine. Mitch Reed was a local activist working on the pro-tunnel campaign. Roughly 6 months before the county was set to vote on the question, he faxed a public records request to the Caltrans office in Oakland. Routine paperwork, a shot in the dark. The next day, a dozen pages came back. Among them was a 1993 internal memo from James Roberts, not a junior analyst, but the chief of the Division of Structures at Caltrans. And what the document showed was the thing everyone had suspected and nobody could prove. The agency had intentionally overestimated the cost of the tunnel in order to support the freeway bypass. The inflated number wasn't a mistake. It was a strategy. For years, the official answer to the question, "Why can't we have a tunnel?" had been a price tag, and the price tag was a prop. A state agency, funded by the public, had put its thumb on the scale to protect a highway plan the public had been fighting since the 60s. Kirstine Tucker's word for the agency's whole posture was hubris. The documents made it look more like policy. Here's the beautiful, very American twist. The people didn't sue this time. They didn't petition. They went over Caltrans's head entirely to the ballot. Measure T went before San Mateo County voters on November 5, 1996. The question, in essence, should the county's official preference be the tunnel instead of the bypass? The campaign had everything: the fresh memory of 158 severed days, the leaked memo, the appalled locals with their drawings of 275-foot cuts through a state park. The measure passed in a landslide of its own. County voters approved it overwhelmingly, by a margin sources put at roughly 3/4 of the vote. And then came the fastest reversal in this entire 76-year saga. On November 9th, 4 days after the election, Caltrans announced it now supported the tunnel as the best environmental, economic, and popular alternative at Devil's Slide. 4 days. The agency had spent nearly 4 decades insisting the bypass was the only rational option, and the tunnel was an expensive fantasy. It took 96 hours of election results to discover the opposite. 38 years of engineering certainty dissolved by one Tuesday of voting. The stupid part is not that the numbers changed. The stupid part is how quickly they changed once the public stopped asking and started deciding. So the coast side had won. The tunnel was the plan. Congressman Tom Lantos, whose district included this stretch of coast, went to work in Washington prying loose the federal money a project like this demands, a fight that would take years of its own, and one he pursued relentlessly after watching what 1995 did to his constituents. But notice what hadn't changed. Not 1 inch of rock had been bored. The vote was a preference, not a portal. Ahead lay environmental studies, engineering, funding battles, design, the slow machinery of actually building the second and third longest road tunnels in California history. Ground wouldn't even be broken until May of 2005. Nearly 9 years after Measure T boring wouldn't start until 2007. Which meant the road, the actual physical moving road, had to keep doing its job for another decade and a half after the county voted to abandon it. Every commuter, every school bus, every tourist chasing the coastline, every local heading home in the fog after dark, still on the slide, still on the crack gauges, still trusting 600 feet of pavement that had already dropped 5 feet once and had been formally sentenced to retirement. The mountain had been patient since 1940. It had outlasted the railroad, the bypass, the lawsuits, and the memo. And it had one more closure left in it, one final demonstration timed almost perfectly, as if to remind everyone digging the escape tunnel exactly what they were escaping from. It started, the way it always started, with a crack in the pavement, 1 inch wide. April 2006. The tunnel is funded, approved, designed, and not yet started. And after more than a month of relentless rain, the soil under Devil's Slide reaches its saturation point and does the thing it has done since 1940. On a Friday, Caltrans crews spot a 1-inch gap opening in the roadbed. By Sunday, it's 4 inches. The pavement is developing long cracks running with the road instead of across it, the signature of a slope preparing to leave, with the highway on its back. Then a 6-foot boulder comes down out of the hillside and lands on the road. A Caltrans spokeswoman, Lauren Wunder, delivered the 2 facts that summed up the whole morning. They were fortunate no one was on the road at the time, and the highway was now closed indefinitely. Indefinitely. Not for repairs. Indefinitely because the crews couldn't even begin work. The ground was so waterlogged that engineers had to wait for the mountain to dry out before they could safely touch it. Technicians took soil samples and went home. The road an entire coastline depended on was closed, and the official plan was to wait for the weather. South of the slide, the businesses started their arithmetic all over again. At the Half Moon Bay Brewery in Princeton, a restaurant that had remodeled and reopened its kitchen a week earlier, bartender Dawn Boriolo described the first day of the closure in one word: dead. Anything longer than a week, she said, and employees start to worry. At the Farallona Inn, Raj Mithal could only hope this one wouldn't be as bad as 1995. Fire and medical coverage from Pacifica was severed again. The commute stretched back toward 2 hours. The closure lasted about 5 months. 5 more months of a coastline held hostage by 600 feet of ground, a full decade after the county had voted to leave that ground forever. If anyone needed a final argument for the tunnel, the mountain had just written it, in a crack that grew 3 inches over a weekend. And this time, the escape was finally physically underway. Ground had been broken in May of 2005. On September 17, 2007, the boring machinery started chewing into the solid rock of Montara Mountain, behind the slide zone. 2 parallel tubes, each 30 feet in diameter, the first new highway tunnels attempted in California in nearly half a century. Nothing about it went fast. The work fell behind schedule. The San Francisco Chronicle was still reporting delays in 2011. Crews ground forward foot by foot, building not just tubes, but a life support system, 32 jet-powered ventilation fans, 10 fireproof shelters between the bores, twin 1,000-foot bridges flown across a valley just to reach the portals. All of it to replace 600 feet of bad road. The final bill, $439 million, something like $700,000 per foot of the problem it solved. That number sounds insane until you total up 76 years of the alternative, the endless repairs, the $3 million patches, the 158-day sieges, the ambulances routed 45 miles around a 5-foot drop in the pavement. The tunnel wasn't expensive. Staying was expensive. The tunnel was just the first time the state paid the bill all at once. One person didn't live to see it. Tom Lantos, the congressman who had spent years after 1995 wrestling the federal funding loose, died in February 2008, months after the digging began. The tunnels were named for him, the Tom Lantos tunnels. Locals, being locals, mostly called them what everyone was always going to call them, the Devil's Slide tunnels. The man who built the exit never got to drive through it. On September 30th, 2010, crews broke through the northern bore. Daylight on both ends. After 52 years of plans, lawsuits, memos, and votes, there was finally a hole through the mountain. On March 25, 2013, Caltrans shut down the old highway across Devil's Slide. The next morning, the tunnels opened to traffic, 4,149 feet northbound, 4,008 feet southbound, the second and third longest road tunnels in the state. At the ribbon cutting, Caltrans Director Malcolm Doherty declared that residents would no longer have to worry about winter storms closing the road, which was true. It was also, if you'd been following along since 1958, a remarkable sentence for Caltrans to deliver in front of cameras, a celebration of the exact solution the agency had once priced into fantasy to make sure it never happened. Nobody at the podium mentioned the memo. The tunnel didn't care. Concrete doesn't hold grudges. Think about what that first night meant. For 76 years, there had been cars on Devil's Slide after dark, headlights threading the fog over the drops, tires on pavement that moved when nobody was watching. On the night of March 25, 2013, that simply stopped. Not gradually. Completely. The most dangerous 600 feet on the California coast went from state highway to closed road between one sunset and one sunrise. The mountain kept sliding, presumably. There was just no one left to threaten. And here's where the story refuses to end the way you'd expect. The old road didn't get demolished. On March 27, 2014, almost exactly a year after the last car, the old alignment reopened as the Devil's Slide Trail, 1.3 miles of the former Highway 1, repaved and repainted for hikers and cyclists. Sit with the irony because it's the best one in the whole file. The only way this road ever became safe was by banning the thing it was built for. Take away the cars, and Devil's Slide becomes what it secretly always was underneath the fear, one of the most beautiful stretches of ground in California. The killer commute became the slowest, gentlest road on the coast. People now push strollers down the centerline where drivers once white-knuckled through fog. Same asphalt, same drops, same moving mountain. The only variable that changed was speed, and it turns out speed was the whole problem. Walk it today, and the road tells you its own biography. The alignment still carries the geometry of the Ocean Shore Railroad. You are walking a curve laid out for trains in 1906 by a company that went bankrupt before your grandparents were born. The pavement still wears the patches and seams of 70 years of emergency repairs. Below the south end, the twin portals sit in the hillside, and every minute or so a car enters one side, and this is the entire $439 million miracle, comes out the other side, every single time. And above it all, still balanced on its pinnacle, is the bunker. The World War II observation post, built on solid ground in 1943, now stranded on a column of rock because the solid ground left without it. It's fenced, it's on failing terrain, and people still climb to it anyway. The after-dark warning has simply found a new audience. The bunker is the last thing on this coast still doing what the old road did, standing on ground that is quietly, measurably running out. Pull up a satellite view sometime. The map is honest in a way the paperwork never was. There's Highway 1, confident and yellow, ducking inland through the mountain. And there, clinging to the coastline it abandoned, is a thin gray thread, the old road, officially erased from the highway system, physically permanent on the cliff. Governments can remove a road from their maps. Removing it from the ground is another department, and that department is closed. Run the final numbers as echoes. A 45-mile detour replaced by a 4,149-foot tube. 158 days of closure replaced by a trail that opens every morning without drama. 5 feet of slippage in 1995. 0 feet that matter ever again. Caltrans said a tunnel would cost $126 million and couldn't be done. It cost $439 million and was done, which means everyone's numbers were wrong. The agencies just happened to be wrong on purpose. Some of the record is still blurry, and it's worth saying so. The exact vote margin on Measure T gets reported a couple of different ways, and the full accounting of everything that went over that cliff in 76 years lives scattered across decades of newspaper archives. The road kept some things, but the core is documented down to the page. A railroad chose the route and died. A state inherited it and spent 76 years in denial. An agency faked a number. A citizen faxed a request. A county voted. A congressman found the money and missed the opening. And a machine finally did what half a century of meetings could not. It went around. Go there at the end of a clear day, just before the gates close. The old centerline is freshly painted, crisp yellow dashes, leading nowhere a car will ever go again. The fog works its way up the cliffs, the way it always has. Below, headlights slide into the mountain and reappear on the far side, over and over, a trick that took 55 years to learn. Up on the old road, there's nothing but wind, the gauge scars in the pavement, and the Pacific doing its slow demolition work underneath everything. For 76 years, the advice was simple. Never drive through Devil's Slide after dark. Nobody does now. Nobody can. The road finally kept everyone safe the only way it ever knew how, by outliving its own traffic, alone on the cliff, in the dark, still moving.